I was printing. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I hope everybody was able to have a good lunch. We're going to start our next session, which is affordable, accessible housing for people with disabilities. My name is Melanie Washington, and I'll be facilitating this session. We have 4 panelists for this session, and so I am going to read their bios, and as I read your bio, I want you to turn your camera on so people can see who you are, and then turn them off as I move to the next person. I'm going to start with Gordon Levine. Gordon has worked for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, managing Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, Louisiana's largest coalition to end homelessness since 2017. But before moving to Louisiana, he administered several federally funded programs for the state of Wisconsin, including HUD's Emergency Solutions Grant and Home Tenant-Based Rental Assistance Program, and SAMHSA's projects for assistance in transition from homelessness, which is the PATH program. He is a primary architect of the Louisiana's response to homelessness during the COVID-19 emergency, including developing the state's 3-part response model. He lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana with his family, including 2 small dogs and a dozen of bonsai trees. Hello, Gordon. Next, I will introduce Amitai Heller. Amitai Heller has been a staff attorney with the Disability Rights Louisiana since 2015. Amitai, if you can turn on your video. No, it won't turn on. Bambi, you may have to give him permission to turn on his video. There it is. His practice focuses on the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Medicaid Act, and the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities in Louisiana. He has been lead counsel on numerous civil rights suits, including the recently settled AJ versus Gee, a class action guaranteeing the provision of in-home nursing services to children with severe disabilities. He has been a presenter at a number of conferences, including the Health Advocates Conference and the National Disability Rights Network's annual conference. Prior to entering the legal field, Amitai worked as an urban planner and as a tenant organizer in his hometown of San Francisco. Amitai has devoted his life to the pursuit of social justice, the rights of marginalized populations, and the dignity of working people. And Amitai, am I saying your name correctly?
Amitai, but that's close. I never really correct people, so.
Amitai. Okay, thank you. Okay. Next, we have Sharon Hennessey. Sharon is a self-advocate and longtime advocate for individuals with disabilities. Ms. Hennessey graduated from the University of New Orleans with a Master's of Education degree in Special Education, Habilitative Services, and has received specialized training in many areas during her 30 years of work experience in the disability community. She has conducted workshops in disability sensitivity and awareness, accessibility, employment, work and benefits analysis, fair housing, affordable and accessible housing, the ABLE Act, the Disability Integration Act, was a self-advocate and self-determination, well as self-advocacy and self-determination. Ms. Hennessey is currently the director of People First of Louisiana, a statewide self-advocacy organization made up of people with disabilities. Thank you, Ms. Hennessey. Last but not least, we have Renee Corrigan. Renee has worked with LAFHAC, LAFAC, since 2015 and currently serves as the Education and Outreach Coordinator. She conducts fair housing trainings for a variety of audiences throughout Louisiana and works with teachers and administrators to engage children and youth in conversation about fairness, justice, and equity through LAFAC's Fair Housing 5 programs. Before joining LAFHAC, because I don't know if I should be saying LAFAC, Renee was...
And that's the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center.
Okay. Renee was the education coordinator for the New Orleans affiliate of the National Alliance of Mental Illness on Mental Illness. She also conducts Undoing Racism workshops with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Thank you, Renee. So now we will move into short presentations, and we'll be starting off with Gordon.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction. My video appears to be frozen, at least on my end. There, very good, there it goes. So my scope is relatively narrower than everyone else's, and so I'm gonna try and keep it focused on really what I'm able to talk about and what I do. So I work for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, and for the Louisiana Housing Corporation, I manage the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is Louisiana's largest coalition to end homelessness. So if you live or work in Baton Rouge or Lake Charles or Houma or any of their surrounding parishes or Natchitoches, Sabine or Plaquemines and St. Bernard, you fall in my catchment area. I'm one of several continuum of care managers across the state. I'm focused in Baton Rouge because, of course, that's my largest municipal area, but we provide services to more than half of the state's total geography. So ultimately, I'm here to kind of answer three questions. How can people access shelter during COVID-19? How can people experiencing homelessness with disabilities access federally funded services in general? And how can organizations that want to provide services to people experiencing homelessness, including people with disabilities, successfully apply for federal funding? And I want to take that from sort of smallest to broadest. In terms of accessing shelter during COVID-19, Louisiana is in this, as it often has been, a leader in preventing and ending homelessness nationally. One of the things that I think we're all really sensitive to is that whenever there's a list of states ranked from 1 to 50 and something, Louisiana is often near the bottom of that list. But in terms of homelessness, we're near the top. We, since 2012, have reduced homelessness in Louisiana by 69%, by creating additional shelters, by creating additional housing projects, but most significantly by creating a really strong permanent supportive housing program statewide that's enabled people who are experiencing chronic homelessness and who are living with disabilities to receive open-ended long-term vouchers and wraparound case management and supportive services, while also implementing a strong diversion program. Diversion in our case meaning a case management program designed to return people to housing via their friends, family, faith networks, etc., via mediation rather than by a public subsidy. So during COVID-19, we again are really at the forefront of national implementation of services for people experiencing homelessness. The last time that I checked for the balance of state continuum of care, we start that sentence from a different place. Every year in January, we conduct a census, we and every other community in the country, of people experiencing literal homelessness, and which means both sheltered and living on the streets or in another place not meant for human habitation. In January 2020, we counted 282 people, either single persons or people living in multi-person households. we counted 283 people. And as of last count this morning, we had created additional shelter beds and sheltered since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic 282 people. And so we've got pretty much 100% coverage in the majority of the state for shelter during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's fundamentally a response to our knowledge that experiencing unsheltered homelessness is itself a high risk factor for people who, for morbidity and mortality for COVID-19. People who are living on the streets don't have access to sanitary facilities, can't self-isolate, and are more likely to congregate. So, the upshot of all of that is that you may be aware or you may have some intuition that people who are experiencing homelessness are disproportionately likely to be living with either a physical or a mental or a developmental disability. And some of that that's a correlation in two directions. Some of that is because people who are living with disabilities are disproportionately likely to have additional housing barriers that could lead to homelessness. And some of it is because the condition of homelessness is necessarily and unfortunately a situation that is more likely to cause the occurrence of disabilities, especially mental disabilities. And I should say that as someone who is living with a severe and persistent mental disability. I was diagnosed with PTSD about 10 years ago. And so I'm very sensitive and very acutely aware of the ways in which homelessness can have an impact on a person's mind, body, and way of being in the world. And so how can a person get access to shelter during COVID-19? Happily, very few people are still experiencing unsheltered homelessness in most areas of the state. But should you, in your professional career or personal life, encounter someone who's experiencing homelessness, what we want you to do is to connect them with your local coordinated entry access point. Coordinated entry being our name in the homelessness world for a system whereby you can present at any one of a number of different locations, or present by phone, or present online, or present to an outreach worker and request housing and services, and then be connected to whatever is available, regardless of where you happen to present. And so the way to access services is to present at your local access point. There is a list of access points, of all of the access points statewide, at the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care's website at laboscoc.org. Now, it's very easy to find from there. There's a visual navigation, there's a text-based navigation, there's a tab-based navigation. It should be very accessible to anyone who needs to get a hold of it. And that's going to have phone numbers, that's going to have addresses, it'll have dates and times, etc. And then as part of that, we've stood up in most areas of the state what we would call non-congregate shelter, which is the sort of FEMA term for we've identified hotel rooms to rent for the short to medium duration for people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, which again, that unfortunately has a significant overlap with people who are living with disabilities. So that's really the process there. The non-congregate shelter piece is really a short-term solution, and it's intended to be a short-term solution as additional funds from the CARES Act are being made available to states, including Louisiana, and to municipalities, including Baton Rouge, Shreveport, New Orleans. We're standing up medium and longer-term housing options. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. That web address, again, is going to be the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care's website at laboscoc.org. That's laboscoc.org. And so ultimately, that's exactly the answer to my next question, which is how do people experiencing homelessness who are living with disabilities access federally funded services? It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. Go to a coordinated entry access point, explain that you're experiencing homelessness, and you'll be directed to the relevant level of services. And I want to both modulate expectations there, and give you an idea of what the real landscape is. Generally speaking, housing is not available on a first come first serve basis, but rather on the basis of acuity of need. right? The reason we have homelessness is because there aren't enough resources to go around. There are, in fact, most of the time, not nearly enough resources to go around. And so when someone requests services, there's usually an escalating series of mediation conversations to try and divert the person back to housing without applying any kind of subsidy. But ultimately, if those are unsuccessful, a person, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, can really expect to receive at least access to non-congregate shelter, as the coverage for that is very close to 100% statewide. Finally, I want to talk about the long-term plan. So the short-term plan, as I said, is that we are getting as many people as possible who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness into non-congregate shelter. Everybody else is in traditional shelter or congregate shelter. And so, as a result of that, we've come very close to ending unsheltered homelessness, at least in advance of any eviction wave that might be coming in Louisiana. So the medium-term goal there is to move people from shelter, which isn't housing, but is a temporary place, is by definition a temporary place, and into permanent housing through a program model that's fundamentally called rapid rehousing, which is a medium-term federally funded voucher that could last anywhere from a month to 2 years. And it comes with case management, wraparound services, and so on. But ultimately, what we know is that when a person is experiencing chronic homelessness and living with a severe and persistent disability of any kind, 2 years is often not enough to achieve self-sufficiency. 10 years is often not enough. And so we have this longer-term model called permanent supportive housing, which is an unlimited duration subsidy with case management and supportive services. It is reserved exclusively for people experiencing chronic homelessness who are living with a disability, and it's really intended to ensure that people who need assistance in a consistent and ongoing way, who really can't be expected to go out and earn a sustainable living wage at this point in their life, or in a consistent way, can live independently and successfully with a level of support that they need that's tailored to their individual and specific housing barriers. And so, organizations that are interested in providing either the housing or the services component of that, we expect the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is the primary funder of services here in Louisiana, to make available additional dollars for PSH in the very near future. In any other year, those dollars would already be available, and your COC managers statewide would be banging down your doors and asking you to apply. The money isn't there yet. We expect it to be there very soon. Historically, our applications have been due by the end of September. There may be a little flexibility about that there, but ultimately, if you're an organization interested in providing housing or services to people experiencing homelessness, I would urge you to contact your local continuum of care and get on their radar as someone that's interested in applying so that they can hook you in with announcements and other resources. The best way to do that is to go again to laboscoc.org, look up one of those coordinated entry access points, call them, and explain that you're looking not for services, but to contact the local continuum of care. And they'll put you in contact with the person in question. If that's too much effort, though, you can go to that same website, go to the contact page. My information and my staff's information is there. Reach out to me, let me know what area of the state you operate in, and I'll make sure that you're connected with the right person. So that's about as briefly as I've ever spoken in my life. So I'm going to go ahead. I recognize that I've got 6 minutes left on my initial docket. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here, take any questions, and then relinquish the microphone.
Well, you did a great job, and that was a lot of good information. It looks as if we do not have any questions in the chat. So,
Okay, very good. Well, then I appreciate all of your time, and I wish you the joy of a conference and a good weekend.
thank you so much. You do the same.
Gordon, this is Bambi. Can you stay on in case there's questions towards the end?
Sure, I'd be very happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So next we will have Renee with LAFHAC.
Yeah, thank you so much. LAFAC, or the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I had some trouble with my microphone a little earlier.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'm just going to give some basics of fair housing overall, And then Amitai mentioned that he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about some current issues. I will mention some ways that fair housing applies in a COVID situation. And then I'll be open for questions after that. So we're a private nonprofit civil rights organization, the Louisiana Fair Housing Action Center. We fight housing discrimination all across the state of Louisiana. We have 4 different departments that do that. So the first is our enforcement department, and that's made up of our attorneys and investigators. If you think you've experienced housing discrimination, you call them. They'll investigate the complaint. If they find good evidence, they'll then represent you free of charge in state or federal court, or to file a complaint with HUD. And just a note, I'm not an attorney, and nothing I say today is legal advice, but we absolutely do have attorneys on staff who are happy to talk with you. And so please, you're welcome to call our office if you have any specific questions. Our enforcement department also conducts investigations using mystery shoppers. A lot of people think that housing discrimination, it's something that used to happen way back when. It doesn't happen anymore. But our investigations show that housing discrimination is still incredibly prevalent all throughout our community. A lot of different types of discrimination are happening every day. We are always looking for mystery shoppers. If you know anyone who's interested in working with our team, it's a very, very part-time job, but it is paid. Right now, during the COVID pandemic, it's being done virtually. And it's a great way for someone to make a little bit of extra money and support civil rights work in the community. You can get more information on our website, lafairhousing.org, and I'll put that in the chat. We also have a homeownership protection program, which helps people prevent foreclosure. And we have an education and outreach department that I direct. So if you know of any organizations or groups that would like to get a Know Your Rights training about fair housing, or housing providers who would like that training, you can always call our office and we're happy to provide that. And then we have a policy department, so we work for policies at the local, state, and federal level, make housing more fair and accessible for everyone. So some wins we've had: several years ago, we got a law passed in Louisiana that protects the housing rights of survivors of domestic violence. Recently, we also were able to win some security deposit reform. And right now, we're working really hard to advocate for protections and support for renters to stop the coming eviction crisis that we're staring down right now due to the COVID-19 disaster. If you want to get involved and support that work, I really hope that you do. Go ahead and sign up for our email list at lafairhousing.org. You can also like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. So, fair housing basics. A lot of the work that we do is enforcing a law called the Fair Housing Act, which was signed on April 11th, 1968, exactly 1 week after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it was one of the most important achievements of the civil rights movement. It applies to pretty much any housing transaction you can think of. So that includes rentals, sales, insurance, lending, advertising, harassment, and zoning. Lots of different types of housing transactions. And it applies to a lot of different kinds of housing. So, homes, single-family homes, apartments, condos. It can also apply to nursing homes, dormitories. It can also often apply to homeless shelters as well. Not all the time, but often. There are 7 what's called protected classes. So that's groups of people, and it's illegal to discriminate against someone based on that basis. And so those protected classes are race, color, religion, and national origin. Those were all added in 1968 when the law was originally passed. Sex was added in 1974. And then family status, which is having children, either your biological children, adopted children, children that you're in the process of getting custody of, or being pregnant. You can't be discriminated against based on that basis. And that was added to the law in 1988. And then disability was also added in 1988. Sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally protected classes, but often discrimination based on those things can be considered illegal discrimination on the basis of sex. And so if you ever encounter someone, or if you experience discrimination because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, please do call our office. There are also federal protected classes anywhere you go in the United States. There are also state protected classes, which are identical. And then there are some local protections in New Orleans and in Shreveport. A really important part of fair housing law is that a policy that has a disparate impact on protected class members can violate the law even if that's not the intent. So in addition to those protected classes, there are other groups of people who do have some fair housing protections. So it's important for you to know about that as well. So for example, if there's a policy that consistently harms survivors of domestic violence, like a zero tolerance policy that says that anyone who is part of domestic violence, whether the perpetrator or the survivor gets evicted, that policy is going to consistently, reliably, unfairly impact people based on sex, because women are more likely to be survivors of domestic violence. And so that policy will also likely violate the law. Similarly, a policy that screens out anyone who has a criminal background, anyone who has criminal justice involvement, having a criminal background is not a protected class, but consistently over time, that policy is going to have an unfair impact based on race because of the way that African Americans are overly targeted by our criminal justice system. And so people who have a criminal background also do have some protection under fair housing law. If you ever have a question about that, if you ever think you're being treated unfairly based on anything, it's worth it to give us a call so we can look a little bit more at that issue. So when it comes to disability discrimination complaints make up more than half of all fair housing complaints that come in across the country. And so it's really important to understand how fair housing relates to disability. Disability is defined really broadly under the Fair Housing Act. It's any sort of physical, mental, or emotional condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that could be a whole lot of different things. I see a question in the chat. A developmental disability and an acquired disability. Oh, that's a question about supported housing. So I guess Mr. Lynn will answer that question. Great, thank you. But under the Fair Housing Act, so again, a lot of different conditions can fall under this. So it could be various physical disabilities. It could include mental or emotional disabilities like PTSD, depression, autism. It could include a history of substance abuse and addiction, being HIV positive, diabetes, heart disease, lots of different things could qualify as a disability under the Fair Housing Act. Someone with a disability may encounter a whole lot of different types of discrimination. So I mentioned those different transactions. We see disability discrimination in all of those different transactions. So for example, when you're trying to rent a home or rent an apartment, we often see steering. Steering is when a housing provider limits your options based on who you are and their assumptions about what you need and what's appropriate for you. So for example, if you are going to look at an apartment complex and the housing provider sees that you walk with some sort of assisted device, or they see that you have a physical disability, and they only show you homes on the first floor. They only show you apartments on the first floor. They don't offer you all the units. That's illegal disability discrimination. Your options have been limited based on someone else's assumptions and discrimination, not on what you've wanted. We've also found another type of discrimination that happens in rentals is when people who are deaf or hard of hearing try and communicate using video relay interpreting, and the housing provider hangs up on them. This happens all the time. The housing provider doesn't know, they don't have the patience, they don't pay attention, and they're shutting out people who are deaf from their properties. That would be illegal disability discrimination. We've also found a lot of folks who are in nursing home settings and are not allowed, not provided an interpreter or other means of communication. And that can have really, really dire consequences. And again, a nursing home can qualify as housing under the Fair Housing Act. And so if that ever happens to anyone here or your clients, we definitely want to know about that. We've also had complaints of people with disabilities who receive disability income from the Social Security Administration, having that income treated differently when they're trying to qualify for a mortgage than earned income. And so that could be illegal disability discrimination. Other things that we've seen, zoning regulations and requirements that prevent the siting of group homes in certain communities for a variety of different discriminatory reasons. And then harassment based on a disability, for example, because of HIV positive status or a perceived disability like a mental illness. All of those things can violate the Fair Housing Act. Something that's also important to know about is that, like in other contexts, when it comes to housing, people with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations, which are physical changes like adding a ramp, grab bars, a doorbell that flashes a light instead of making a sound, widening doorways, lowering light switches, all those sorts of modifications. As long as that's reasonable and necessary for their enjoyment of the home, people with disabilities are entitled to those modifications. We do get a lot of questions about who pays for it. Generally, it's going to be the person, the tenant, the person with the disability has to pay for it unless it's some sorts of federally funded housing. The other thing that people with disabilities are entitled to in their housing are accommodations. So that's a change in a policy or a procedure that the housing provider usually does. So for example, no pets policies are totally legal. Landlords can say no pets, they can say no cats, no dogs, they can say no animals over a certain number of pounds, or no breed, they can have breed restrictions. But if somebody does need an animal because of a disability, so if they have an assistance animal, such as a service animal or an emotional support animal, then the housing provider does have to waive that no pets policy. They have to waive that breed restriction. They have to waive that size restriction. The last thing I want to talk about when it comes to fair housing and disability is that buildings with 4 or more units that were built after 1991 are also required to meet 7 what are called design and construction requirements. And so those include just basic accessibility standards for things like doorways, common areas, and kitchens. And I'll say that briefly, several years ago, we did an investigation in the New Orleans area where we went into buildings that should have been in compliance. And we found that 100% of those buildings were failing on at least one basis, failing to meet these requirements. And 81% had at least two violations of this law. So a lot of our housing is not accessible in a lot of different reasons. And in a lot of cases, it's actually violating the law to not be accessible. This is a very quick overview. We have a ton of information on our website, lafairhousing.org, and you're also always welcome to call us if you have any questions at all.
Thank you so much, Renee.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon, can we get you to answer the question from the chat box? I'll read it for you. Is there any difference between having a developmental disability and an acquired disability later when it comes to a timeline for receiving supported housing?
Sure. So that's a great question. The definition of a disability is pretty broad, as I think we just touched on. It really doesn't matter for the purposes of accessing permanent supportive housing or any other federally funded housing for a person who is living with disabilities, what kind of disability it is, when you acquired that disability, or what disability category it's in. The only question that is, to my knowledge, ever asked for permanent supportive housing, and I believe that this is true for many other kinds of HUD subsidized housing as well, is on the night of intake to the project. So at the time that the project is doing their eligibility screening and making sure that you meet the homelessness definition, that you meet household size definition, etc., that at that time you have a signed letter from an authorized health provider that says, yes, this person has this specific disability. Doesn't matter when you got it, doesn't matter what it is, but you need someone who's licensed by the state who's willing to sign down and say, yes, this person is living with XYZ disability. And if it's all right, Melanie, I see that another question just came through. Does permanent supportive housing have a waiting list, or is it income-based? I'm going to try and answer that question briefly, though it's a big challenge, to be honest, as you're going to see. There really is no income test for it. So there's no income maximum or income cap for permanent supportive housing, or PSH. There are several reasons for that. The most important one being that we know that while income is a major component of why a person might be experiencing homelessness, it's not the only component, especially when we talk about people with severe and persistent disabilities. That's one thing. In terms of a waiting list, I think what you're thinking of is really Section 8, the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which is first come, first served, where they open a waiting list and you put in your name in the hat, and eventually you will be called. That's not how PSH or any of our homelessness programs work. Emergency shelter is first come, first served. There's no waiting list. You show up on the day and you get a bed. For everything else, including PSH, there's usually our coordinated entry process, and it differs from region to region in the state. But usually there's this process of progressive engagement where you show up, and on day one you're connected with shelter, and on day one they'll try to return you to housing via a problem-solving conversation, and over the next period of time they'll try to continue returning you to housing, and then ultimately you'll be assessed using an evidence-based tool to determine your level of need, to triage you in order of highest need to lowest need. And then ultimately, the people with the highest need are going to be contacted first when beds come available. And the reason I mentioned beds becoming available is at any given time, pretty much all of our housing programs statewide are at or above 100% capacity. And so what that means ultimately is, while there is sort of a list that you go on while you're waiting, it's not a waiting list, there's a prioritization list. And someone who has a very high level of need is likely to get into a project very quickly, while a person who has a very low level of need, which usually does not include anyone who is living with a disability, will likely not ever be called, or will not be contacted within any kind of short or medium term.
Thank you so much for answering that question. I was going to let have Renee answer a couple of questions, but I think just to make sure we're good on time, I'll let the next two people present and then we'll come back to questions. So with that being said, we'll have Amitai Keller.
Okay, great. So what I've been asked to talk about today, and what I think is important for people to know, is about evictions and people with disabilities access to the courts right now during COVID. As was mentioned before, I'm an attorney working with Disability Rights Louisiana, and we've been working with a coalition of civil rights attorneys monitoring disability access to eviction courts. The team is a bunch of litigators and also some frontline attorneys who are monitoring the issue around the state. Frontline attorneys, I mean the attorneys who are actually in court from legal aid organizations defending against these evictions. And what we started hearing about once the eviction moratorium was winding down and people were starting to hear that they were getting evicted by their landlords, is that they were terrified, and rightfully so, to go to court because of their disabilities and the underlying comorbidities and their heightened risk of, very bad health outcomes if they contract COVID-19. And, maybe prior to COVID-19, it wasn't a crisis for someone with hypertension to have to appear in court, but now it is. So COVID-19 has really highlighted the needs of people with disabilities to get access to housing court around the state. And it's also really shown us that generally there's been a lack of knowledge amongst judges about how the accommodations process works. And so we're trying to educate people and litigate if necessary, and by people I mean judges and other attorneys, to be requesting accommodations and on behalf of their clients. And also, if you are a person with a disability who does not have access to a lawyer and you're being evicted, or you just have to go to court for some other reason, I just want to be very clear about this issue. You should not be getting evicted if it's too dangerous for you to be in court because of your disability. The Americans with Disabilities Act should provide you some sort of relief in that measure. That's not a 100% rule, but really the way that the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is constructed is to allow for an accommodations process for this exact time. And so the ADA absolutely applies to state courts, and it definitely applies to justices of the peace, who are the people who do the evictions in rural Louisiana and not so rural Louisiana and Jefferson Parish. And those people need to abide by the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a big case about this from the Supreme Court called Hennessey v. Lane. And what that case says is that one of the main reasons that the ADA was passed into law is because people were being excluded from courthouses because of their disabilities. And us civil rights attorneys and lots of people with disabilities are saying that this is a very similar situation to that. And what that case was about, the Supreme Court case, was about basically saying it's not enough just to have a court open. People with disabilities need to be able to actually access that court. They need to have meaningful access to the court. So just because you can theoretically crawl upstairs, if there's no wheelchair ramp, you're really being denied meaningful access. And we think that would guarantee protections to people with disabilities who do not want to appear in court because of the danger possessed by COVID, based on guidance from the CDC and various epidemiologists from around the country, including ones that we've spoken to, who've been cautioning against people going to court. There's a governor's order stating that courts should not be proceeding in person when avoidable. I believe it is still currently in effect, although I'd have to check on that. So it is a little bit more about the Americans with Disabilities Act. it is considered to be discrimination for when someone with a disability is not provided equal opportunity to obtain the same result or to gain a benefit from an existing government program. The courts would be one of those government programs that we're talking about. So what the ADA also says is that courts have an affirmative obligation to make modifications to existing policies, practices, procedures, when such modifications are necessary to avoid discrimination based on disability. And there's some exceptions to that, such as fundamental alteration or an undue burden on the courts, but we don't think those, most of the time, those will not apply in this context. And I want to just distinguish here from something that Renee said about where the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act differs in the way that it treats accommodations or modifications. You know, if you need to make a modification to your house, your landlord might not necessarily have to pay for it, but the court does have a fiscal responsibility to pay for the creation of wheelchair ramps, things like that. And we think that would also apply to the accommodations that people need during COVID-19. And so when we think about what does it mean really to request an accommodation for an eviction court, and really for people with disabilities, they kind of need to think about that for themselves and tailor it individually to their specific needs. So there isn't really a one-size-fits-all approach. But that being said, you know, some things that you might want to consider requesting would be a video conference if you have access to the internet, a continuation to come into court later, potentially a phone hearing, although we don't think that would allow for the best outcomes for people with disabilities, possibly outdoor hearings, you know. So you should get creative. You should think about what's going to work for you, and you should contact an attorney on the matter if you are someone who is getting evicted and is scared to go to court because of COVID-19 on the basis of your disability. Or even if you don't have a disability, you probably have some rights as well. And I'll get into that in just a minute. So, you know, some judges are being really good about this issue. We've spoken to one judge in the 24th Judicial District Court, or a justice of the peace who's doing evictions in Jefferson Parish, who has been going out to low-income people's homes with a hotspot and a tablet so that they can have access to the courts. This is the level of accommodation that we are expecting to be available from other judges if people are being forced to face eviction proceedings in Louisiana. Of course, the CARES Act, which is about to expire, also provides some additional protections. I think it's an extension of a 30-day notice, but I'm not 100% positive on that. But there's a lot of primers on the CARES Act that you can look at to see if you have any further rights on that, although the law is set to expire. So we've been doing some outreach to different judges. We reached out to the Attorney General, who we understand has sent out a memorandum to all justices of the peace explaining the accommodations process and the rights of people with disabilities during coronavirus. We know that First and Second City Court in Orleans Parish, who do all the evictions for the parish, are sending out documents, two-page documents explaining people's rights to have accommodations. And generally what we're hearing is that judges are willing to work with people in Orleans to allow them to not have to come to court during this pandemic. We did have one case where a judge denied an accommodation in St. Helena Parish. And that case was a video conference was requested by a person with a disability, and the judge denied the request, saying that they had to come into court. And the case was appealed, and the First Circuit Court of Appeals in Baton Rouge remanded it, basically saying you have to give this person an accommodation. Now, they didn't rule on the basis of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what they said was that this should really apply to all people, and people should not be coming into court unnecessarily. And anyone can contact me with that question. If you want to get more information about that case, and you need to use it possibly for one of your hearings. Again, also feel free to contact me if you're facing an eviction and you have a disability that requires an accommodation. Our agency does not do the eviction defense. That would be legal aid most likely, but we could certainly work with you potentially to get you the accommodations that you need so that you could have your day in court. And that also applies not just to evictions, but to other access to the court needs. So I'm going to leave it at that and answer any questions about evictions. That was kind of I was trying to kind of breeze through it, but if anyone has any targeted questions, I'm really happy to answer them.
Okay, Amitai, there is a question in the chat, and it's a statement first. You want me to read it out to you? I can. Okay, I'll do it. A study out of Columbia University has a model that estimates a 40 to 45% increase in homelessness this year over last year. With the anticipated increases associated with the economic impact of COVID-19 and the ending of the economic protections to prevent eviction, has there been an increase in funding to assist individuals with disabilities to ensure they are not evicted?
So I don't know that I'm the best person to answer this question, to be honest. I don't know that of funding that's specifically targeted towards people with disabilities. I know that the governor or the state offered some emergency assistance, but that got filled up very quickly. So honestly, I'm just not that familiar with the resources. If anyone else could answer, that would be better.
Gordon, you can go ahead.
Sure. Hello again. As Amitai correctly pointed out, the governor did 2 weeks ago announce the Louisiana Emergency Rental Assistance Program. It announced $24 million as the sort of floor for assistance available for people who are at risk of eviction. 12 million of the and the governor said this in his press conference, and it was pretty inside baseball-y, which was music to my ears and no one else's. But half of that funding is coming from two programs, Home and the Community Development Block Grant, which are sort of general purpose funds that are used for all sorts of different populations. Half of it is coming from the Emergency Solutions Grant, which is one of the two primary federal sources for providing anything to people experiencing homelessness, including emergency rental assistance prevention. And so, as I said before, we know that people experiencing homelessness, especially in Louisiana, are really disproportionately likely to be living with disabilities, and really disproportionately likely to be living with mental disability or developmental disability. And unfortunately, we also know that they comprise a proportionally higher portion of those who are, by HUD's definition, imminently at risk of homelessness, which would mean people who need rental assistance to prevent eviction. We're aware of the Columbia University study, and when I say we, I mean both the Housing Corporation and also all of the continuum of care leads statewide. We've had discussions about it. We're persuaded by its model to some extent. And so ultimately the question is, has there been an increase in funding to assist people with disabilities to ensure they're not evicted? The LERAP program is the first significant swipe at ensuring that that doesn't happen. 12 million out of that 24 is earmarked for people who are at risk of homelessness, who are meet sort of a higher standard of at risk of homelessness, who are more likely to experience homelessness, and who by definition are proportionally more likely to be living with some kind of a disability. my intuition is that we will probably see additional funding at some point in the future. I know that various parties are working on making that happen, but unfortunately I can't announce anything because I don't have anything in my back pocket. But I would focus instead on the fact that although the initial spend down on the LERAP program from that first 12 million is in process, that waiting list is closed, we expect another pot of money to be happening any day now that would be more specifically targeted at the population of people living with disabilities.
Thank you guys so much for that. So I'm going to now move it over to Sharon Hennessey.
Hi, my name is Sharon Hennessey. Actually, I don't have anything prepared. This was kind of a catch-all thing. I am the chairperson of the Housing Committee for the Governance Advisory Council on Disability Affairs. And we are working towards increasing the affordable accessible housing for individuals in Louisiana. So really what I have to say is I just want to make a statement and make sure everyone deals with this and understands it. And it's open for discussion. The main way that people with disabilities, self-advocates, advocates, providers, anyone that's interested in doing this can have an effect on the affordable ability of housing and the availability of housing, affordable, accessible housing in Louisiana is to participate and advocate in the public meeting processes of the planning documents or planning process of the documents that control affordable housing. Basically, HUD does some of this stuff, and it's for affordability and availability. And the Housing Corporation does another process for the basically for availability and a little bit of affordability and availability. And they both have very well-defined, very accessible public comment periods. COVID has had a little bit of impact on the public comment period in that it's made up, the public comment period, both of them, are made up of a period that allows you to make public comment by writing, by email, and also finally by an in-person meeting, and you have a choice of how you want to do it. I know the Housing Corporation this year had to change their public meeting just a little bit. They had to do a call-in to do the public meeting, but they still held it. It was well advertised and it was attended. But that's not always the case. Many times in the public hearings for both the Housing Corporation's public hearings and HUD's public hearings to the entitlement areas and so on, no one shows up. No one is there to talk about what the needs are or to participate in the planning process. And that's, I think, the big takeaway for us as advocates and self-advocates and people that are really concerned about increasing the affordable, accessible housing in Louisiana. If we don't care enough about the issues that we come up with, whether it be rental assistance, availability of housing, they can't find it, we can't find both. You can find one, but not the other. if we don't get enough to show up and make comments about it and give the funders a reason to support us, can we realistically expect things to change? That's really the only question I want to ask. If we don't help people understand what it is we need and the issues that we're facing, how can we expect things to change? That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, I'm looking at the chat box and I don't see any questions, but I do have a few questions I would like for Renee to answer. And that first question, Renee, is how common is housing discrimination in Louisiana, and what are warning signs housing consumers should look for? You're still on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I mentioned that we do audit investigations to see, to kind of take a good guess at what the prevalence is of housing discrimination. I'll just mention a couple, and you can read more about them on our website, read all the details. But I mentioned that accessibility audit that we did that found that 100% of multifamily developments were not in compliance with the law when it comes to accessibility design and construction standards. We also very recently did an audit looking at emotional support animals and accommodation requests for people with disabilities to have those emotional support animals in their home. And we found that 80% of landlords that were asked denied those requests, either an outright denial or they said, oh, I'll get back to you, and never got back to the individual. Some of those denials included some pretty offensive harassment of the person with a disability requesting to have the emotional support animal, making fun of the disability and questioning the need for that animal. And so that's a really common type of discrimination that we found. We've also done a lot of race testing when it comes to rentals. And consistently, we've done several of these audits now, 2007, 2014, and we recently did one. We found about a 50% rate of discrimination against Black mystery shoppers who are equally qualified to the white mystery shopper that we also send out. So we pair our mystery shoppers together. And so we know that if consistently the African-American mystery shoppers are getting worse treatment, even though they're equally qualified, that it's not based on any sort of objective standard, it's based on their race. And often we find in those instances that the housing provider will be polite, but they'll provide different treatment. So they may not even call back the Black tester. They may make an assumption about you based on your name or the sound of your voice. Or sometimes when you speak on the phone with the housing provider, they're very polite, but when you show up and they see you, either they see your race or they see your disability or they see something else about you, all of a sudden they'll say, oh, I'm so sorry, I just rented it to someone else, but best of luck to you. And that sort of, when something just seems off in that interaction, it's confusing, you don't know why. Maybe the housing provider tells you that the apartment's already been rented, but a week later you still see the for rent sign up, something like that that just tells you that something is off in that interaction. We really encourage people to trust your gut instinct. Often, you may not have good proof that you're being discriminated against, but something just tells you that you are. And when we do an investigation, often we're able to confirm that. I also just wanted to say that we see very, very, very high rates of discrimination against people who use vouchers. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or Section 8, in a study that we did in 2009, we found that 82% of landlords wouldn't accept vouchers. And that's definitely an issue for people with disabilities who are disproportionately likely to have those vouchers.
Okay, wow. All right, and one other question, is there anything in particular that people should know about fair housing during the COVID pandemic?
Sure. So I think definitely the information that Amitai provided about asking for accommodations in eviction court is essential. There's a few other fair housing issues that we've seen pop up that we want folks to know about. So unfortunately, people have connected the COVID-19 pandemic and coronavirus with Asian Americans. And so we've seen an increase in national origin harassment and discrimination against people who are Asian American. We've also seen an increase in sexual harassment, especially what's called quid pro quo sexual harassment. And so that's where a housing provider, often taking advantage of a tenant who is vulnerable for different reasons. So maybe they're a person of color, maybe they're undocumented, maybe they have a disability, and then who is experiencing financial difficulty, and when the housing provider tries to get that person to exchange sexual favors for rent or another housing service. And again, this happens when people are experiencing financial difficulty, and unfortunately that's a lot of people all across the state right now. 40% of renters in Louisiana right now are saying that they don't know how they're going to pay rent next month, that they're concerned they won't be able to pay rent next month. So we're afraid that a lot of people are vulnerable to this sort of behavior. Sexual harassment in housing is sex discrimination and it's illegal, and the Fair Housing Act is a good way to hold those landlords accountable. If you do hear about this happening, what we find is that usually there isn't just one victim. There's usually a housing provider who has a pattern of targeting people for this sort of behavior, so definitely let us know. And then the last thing is just, Amitai mentioned accommodations that someone with disabilities might look for in eviction court, and so that would fall under the ADA, but there also might be housing related accommodations that you might want to ask for from a housing provider due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So if someone has a disability that makes them more vulnerable to a more severe infection, then they might ask, for example, that if the property manager has to come over to the unit, that they wear a mask anytime they're on the premises. Or if they have to have a meeting with the housing authority, you could request that that meeting occur virtually or over the phone rather than having to go in person to the housing authority. There can be a lot of different ways that people with disabilities can use Fair Housing Act protections to keep themselves safe during the pandemic.
Very good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are 2 questions in the chat. I'll read the first one. Have you found the lack of accessible housing has increased since Katrina in many elevating housing? I'm not quite sure who can answer that question, but any of you can jump in if you have an answer for that.
I can answer it just a little bit, and just for Baton Rouge. The only thing that I have to say about it, and I want to make space for others to try and answer as well, is that not necessarily since Katrina, but since the 2016 floods alone, we know that the affordable housing stock, which strongly correlates with the accessible housing stock, dropped something like 25% in the wake of the 2016 floods in East Baton Rouge Parish. I would imagine that other parishes were similarly affected.
Okay, thank you. And the second question, I know you said you could also take it, I'll read it. I live in Lake Charles and we only have 2 shelters for females, and one is only for domestic violence victims and the other is small and always full. We have a difficult time assisting parents with disabilities that have children. Any recommendation?
Yeah, I don't have a good recommendation. Its only virtue is that it's the right one. The reality is that there simply aren't enough emergency shelter beds, traditional emergency shelter beds, anywhere in the state of Louisiana, period. And so if you want more emergency shelter beds in Lake Charles, it's important that you advocate to those who are empowered to fund those activities, and say that this is something that you're looking for. And there are a variety of options there. You can advocate to your local business association. You can advocate to your local municipal authorities. You can speak to your political leaders. Any of them are options for looking at funding availability. Though I must be honest, there's very little funding available for traditional shelter. I mean, it's very, very little. And so if emergency shelter is something that you feel Lake Charles needs locally, as I said earlier, Lake Charles is part of my area, and I've been advocating for additional emergency shelter there for as long as I've been in this position. I encourage you to make your voice heard and known. For the immediate future, non-congregate shelter beds should be available regardless of household composition and regardless of disability status. And so I encourage you to reach out to the Calcasieu Parish Police Jury if you have a family that's in need, and make that need and their contact information known. They should be able to get you squared away.
I also would just like to add, so we'd have to look at this on a case-by-case basis, but if the family is being turned away, not because the shelter is full, but because of a disability or because they have children, then we would want to take a look at that particular situation as well.
Thank you guys very much. So with no other questions in the chat, would any of you like to have any final or closing thoughts before we end the session? If not, I think we'll be done a few minutes early. And we would like all of you to all of the panelists to turn your videos on so that we could get that picture. Bambi, are you there?
I'm here.
You wanted to get a picture of everyone?
Yes. We'll get tell you when, as soon as I get my little snippet. We appreciate y'all did a great job.
I'm sorry, did we miss Jonathan? I think are you next? So yeah, so we want to get the panelists for the housing session. Sorry, you'll be next. There we go.
Okay, just a second. Okay, y'all, YouTube's a little bit delayed, so we'll, just takes a second. Y'all can go ahead and smile. So when it comes up, you'll look great.
It's like the longest I've ever smiled in my life.
Okay, got it. Thank you,
All right.
guys. Yeah, there's about a 30-second delay, I think.
And so there still is a few minutes. Gordon, you had more you'd like to talk about?
Oh, well, what a terrible door for you to open. No, I think I really I feel like I've hit all the big buttons. But I think want to just I want to highlight again something that I said earlier. Louisiana is so often at the bottom of those state rankings on just about everything that we can come up with, and it really breaks my heart. But in terms of homelessness, I can't overemphasize the extent to which we have done better than almost any state in the country in reducing homelessness and preventing homelessness. And so one of the fights that we continually have in one of my municipalities is over community leaders who, from time to time, see people experiencing literal homelessness on the streets, and they take it as evidence, with the best of intentions, that there is still a serious problem with homelessness in that municipality. And I agree with them; it is still a serious problem, but only insofar as every single person experiencing homelessness creates a serious problem for the municipality, because it's evidence of a broader systems failure, right? It's not about personal failure. It's about a lack of completeness of a social safety network. It's about the failure of the criminal justice system and the failure of XYZ other contributing things, our employment network, our financing networks, et cetera. And so while the evidence of homelessness is still in front of us, we haven't ended homelessness. Success can't be measured in such a binary sort of we've ended homelessness or we haven't, we've succeeded or we've failed way. It is incredibly important to me that all of you know that no matter where you live in the state, you have service providers who are actively working locally to end homelessness, who have been tremendously successful in reducing the number of people living on the streets, reducing the number of people in shelters, and doing so by moving them into permanent and self-sufficient housing, that number continues to improve despite incredibly challenging economic conditions, and that even during COVID-19, which is a nightmare pandemic, that is one of my personal greatest fears in the world, it's impossible not to recognize that it represents, through the CARES Act funding and through any additional funding, a tremendous opportunity to permanently reduce the number of people experiencing homelessness in Louisiana. That is not just an opportunity, but is a reality. We've done a tremendous job in moving folks off the streets and into shelter. And in the coming weeks, we're going to see unbelievably good numbers, historically unprecedented numbers of people moving from shelters and into permanent housing, where they're getting the level of supportive services that they need to cultivate their own self-sufficiency, either in terms of continuing to receive whatever level of subsidy they need, or returning to a position where they no longer need a subsidy. And so in terms of giving everyone something good to walk away from on a Friday afternoon with a little bit of extra time, you can be genuinely proud of the state that you live in, the community that you live in, and the social services network that you necessarily support, even if indirectly, because our contending with homelessness during the COVID-19 pandemic especially has really been a national best practice from start to finish.
Thank you so much for that information. Sounds like some good things are coming. There are no other questions. 5 minutes left, well, about 4 minutes left to end this session. So Bambi, I think we can go ahead and stop it now.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. We appreciate it so much. Really informative information. And thank you, Melanie, for doing such a great job of facilitating that discussion. What we'll do now is we will continue to have our Zoom. You could stay, if you logged into Zoom, or you could stay watching on YouTube. Our next session starts at 2 o'clock, and it will be on transportation for people with disabilities. So right now we'll just have a break, and we'll see you back on at 2 o'clock.